Wow! And it is all over! You ready? Let's go!
Alright, Sean Shelby, take a seat. I got this. As you guys may have noticed recently, there's been quite a shakeup at the top of the UFC's welterweight division. Kamaru Usman recently dethroned long-reigning champion Tyron Woodley, and now the state of the welterweight division at the top is a little bit crazy. The UFC's booked a couple fights as far as the welterweights go. They have Colby Covington fighting Kamaru Usman, which makes all the sense in the world to me. Colby Covington was supposed to get the shot against Tyron Woodley before they eventually pushed Kamaru Usman into that slot. He had an incredible performance, and like I just mentioned, dethroned Tyron Woodley with quite the dominant performance. Now, I have nothing wrong with that fight. I think Colby should be next. But after that, I completely disagree with the UFC as far as bookings go. Now, most of you guys have probably seen the Ben Askren-Robbie Lawler finish at least once or twice. It was quite a crazy fight, even though it only lasted one round. Robbie Lawler came out, slammed Ben Askren onto his head, looked like he was about to finish Ben Askren with ground and pound, but Ben just would not go away. Eventually, Ben got a hold of him, dragged him to the ground, got him in the bulldog choke, and the rest is history. Kind of. It was obviously a very controversial finish, and as Dana White stated soon after the fight, he wanted an immediate rematch, which I completely agree with. I personally watched the ending of that fight probably close to 100 times, and I gotta say, I'm still not exactly sure how I feel about it. The first couple times I watched it, I saw Robbie Lawler's hand appear to go limp, so I thought it was a justified call. I thought Herb Dean made the right decision by stopping the fight, but then soon after that, I saw a few different camera angles, and it looked like although Robbie Lawler's arm appeared to go limp, about 1 second after that, he did give the thumbs up to Herb Dean, which Herb has stated quite a few times that he could not see based on his angle. So I have placed absolutely no blame on Herb Dean. He didn't have the greatest angle, and from his angle, which is the angle that the crowd initially saw, it did look like, as I've mentioned a couple times, Robbie Lawler's arm went limp, which to Herb Dean meant that he had passed out, and that's why he stopped the fight. But after watching the finish from a couple different camera angles and watching it a few more times, I kind of changed how I felt about the fight. Originally, like I said, I thought Herb Dean was justified in the stoppage, but the more camera angles I saw, the more times I watched it, I started to think that Lawler probably was fine. Herb Dean should have allowed the fight to go on a little bit longer, and therefore I think an immediate rematch is 100% justified. Now, as I stated earlier, that's what Dana White came out and said pretty much immediately after the fight that he wanted to do. As you guys may have also noticed, Ben Askren pretty much immediately after the fight said he will pass on an immediate rematch. Now, I can kind of see how why Ben Askren would say that. He mentioned quite a few times that he wasn't too happy about fighting Robbie Lawler in the first place because he was a big fan of Robbie and he liked the guy. So I can completely understand why he wouldn't want to fight him again. But in the fans' eyes, Ben Askren has to understand, obviously he's watching that fight through his own eyes, so there's always going to be a bias there, clearly. But through the majority of fans' eyes, I think we all kind of saw it for the most part the same way. It was very controversial, like I said, but I think most people would agree that the fight should have been allowed to go on a little bit longer, and Robbie Lawler should have been given more time to get out of that choke, especially considering the amount of damage he did to Ben Askren at the beginning of that round. Personally, I think Ben Askren, a couple of those ground and pound shots looked like they may have put Ben out for a second. So both guys, in a way you could say, were close to being finished. But honestly, I think maybe Ben Askren was closer to being finished in that fight than Robbie Lawler was. So in my mind, I 100% support the rematch. I think that's what needs to be done, especially when there's an ending that is as controversial as that one. After the fight, I'm looking at the UFC rankings right now on their website for the welterweight division, and the current rankings have Ben Askren at number 5 and Robbie Lawler at number 10. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the rankings were before that fight, but they were, I believe, very evenly ranked. They were very close in the rankings, and I don't think that fight really told us anything. If it told us anything at all, it was that both fighters can beat each other, because like I keep mentioning, Ben Askren was close to being out at the beginning of that round, and then you could also argue that Robbie Lawler was close to being out from that choke, or maybe you think he was. It only lasted one round. I think you got to run it back and let it play out a little bit longer. Unfortunately, although Dana White wanted the immediate rematch and he said that's what was going to happen, Ben Askren apparently kept turning it down. And within the last few days, I have seen sources report that the UFC has officially booked Ben Askren and Jorge Masvidal, which, while that may be a good fight, it doesn't make any sense. Now, if the UFC wants to get a ton of views, they want to sell pay-per-views, how in the world can you pretend the thing with Jorge Masvidal and Leon Edwards in the back after Jorge Masvidal's fight never happened? That exchange happened. The three-piece and the soda happened. Everybody saw it. That video clip that ESPN had of the altercation backstage between Leon Edwards and Jorge Masvidal got a ton of views, and there is an incredible storyline right there. You got the three-piece and the soda. There's a ton of hostility between the two. The story pretty much wrote itself backstage after Jorge Masvidal's win. And you're going to tell me the UFC isn't going to jump at that opportunity to sell that fight? Like I said, it pretty much already sold itself. I think the majority of the fans are more interested in that fight than Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren, at least right now, because it makes sense. Like I said, the UFC doesn't really need to try to sell that fight. It already sold itself. And they're not jumping at that opportunity. That confuses me. Once again, as I'm looking at the UFC welterweight rankings, Ben Askren, like I mentioned, is at number 5. Leon Edwards is all the way down at number 11. But if you don't give Ben Askren that win, which I don't think you really can because of how controversial it was, I think those two would be very close in the rankings, and I think that fight makes all the sense in the world. They're both strikers. They both looked great in their last fight. I think it'd be a very entertaining fight to watch, and like I said many times before this, the story is already written. The UFC doesn't have to do any promoting. It makes no sense to me why that fight's not happening. Like I said a minute ago, the fight that did just get booked is Jorge Masvidal and Ben Askren, which makes absolutely no sense to me. Let me explain why. Without a doubt, Jorge Masvidal's performance against Darren Till was nothing short of extremely impressive. Although he lost the first round, he found his range in the second round and he put Darren Till away like nobody has ever before. It was an impressive performance, but you can't take only that performance into account when you book the Ben Askren fight. If you go back and look at Jorge Masvidal's record prior to the Darren Till fight, he was 0-2 in his last two fights, which were against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Damian Maia. And as I said, the UFC just booked him to fight Ben Askren. If you watch the Damian Maia fight, although it was a split decision, I thought it was a little more clear-cut than that in the way of Damian Maia. The fight played out pretty much exactly how I thought it would. Damian Maia went for the takedown the entire fight. He was pretty much Jorge Masvidal's backpack the majority of that fight. He just kept relentlessly going for takedown after takedown. He made the fight pretty much 100% a grappling match, and that is exactly what Ben Askren is going to do. So we've kind of already seen that fight before. And like I mentioned, prior to the impressive performance against Darren Till, Jorge Masvidal was 0-2 in his last two fights. So obviously beating Darren Till the way he did by a brutal knockout was an impressive performance. I have no idea how that skyrockets Jorge Masvidal to number 4 in the UFC welterweight rankings when he's now 1-2 in his last 3. That doesn't make any sense to me. It was an impressive performance, but you got to take some other factors into account, like his previous performances and the fact that he hadn't fought in like a year and a half. And like I said, you go back to 3 fights ago, he just fought Damian Maia, who has a very, very similar style to Ben Askren. I think Damian Maia obviously has the better jiu-jitsu, but Ben Askren definitely has the better takedowns. Aside from that, they have a very similar style of fighting. They're both trying to get their guy to the ground and keep him there. And I think if Ben Askren fights Jorge Masvidal, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be a frustrating fight for Masvidal. Ben Askren's going to be relentless with the takedowns. He's going to keep going, keep attacking relentlessly, going for the takedown until he eventually gets Jorge Masvidal down. And then I think for the majority of the fight, he's going to keep him there. I don't think it will be the most entertaining fight in the world. Certainly not fireworks like I think the Jorge Masvidal and Leon Edwards fight would be. So I do not understand why the UFC booked that fight. Frustrating to say the least. They have a great fight that's given to them on a silver platter. All they got to do is reach out and grab it, and they completely ignore it. Pretend that altercation backstage didn't even happen. I don't get it. Aside from that, if it was me, I would book Jorge Masvidal against Leon Edwards, and Ben Askren against Robbie Lawler, because that makes sense to me. I don't see how you could do anything else. Maybe Ben Askren just flat out said he would never take that fight, and that kind of forced the UFC's hand to do something else, and maybe that's why they eventually booked the two fights the way they did. But without being able to be behind the scenes with the UFC, it's tough to know exactly how that situation played out. Aside from those two fights, you now have Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Darren Till, who were huge favorites going into their fights, and they both suffered the first knockout of their career in absolutely devastating fashion. And ironically, both to two guys that were previously lightweights in the UFC. Once again, looking at the rankings, they have Stephen Wonderboy Thompson at number 7 and Darren Till at number 6. I'm not quite sure how, according to the rankings, Darren Till moved up a spot after that brutal knockout, and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson dropped 4 spots. I completely understand fighters dropping spots after they take a loss. That makes sense, right? Can't quite understand how they move up in ranks after a loss. And if you're comparing the Darren Till fight against Jorge Masvidal to the Stephen Wonderboy Thompson fight against Anthony Showtime Pettis, you got to take into account how the two fights played out. Without a doubt, Stephen Thompson, if you actually watch the fight, he was dominating Anthony Pettis up until the point of that crazy Superman hook, I suppose you could call it, that Anthony threw at the end of, what was it, the second or third round? There was only a couple seconds left. But up until that point, without a doubt, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson was absolutely piecing Anthony Pettis up. He was comfortably in control of that fight. And like Anthony Pettis has been known to do in the past, came up with some magic at the end of the round, threw that crazy Superman hook, and that's all she wrote. Now going back to the Darren Till, Jorge Masvidal fight, Darren Till, I think, comfortably won the first round, but that fight was a lot closer. And in the second round, it did look like Jorge Masvidal was taking control. He was winning that round, in my opinion. He was landing the better combos. He was landing great counters. And the finish, to me, wasn't quite as surprising. How badly Darren Till got knocked out and how long he was out, that part was surprising. But the fact that Jorge Masvidal won was not too all surprising, the way the momentum seemed to shift in the second round. So I think you got to kind of take that into account. I'm not really sure who does the UFC rankings, and to a lot of people, a lot of MMA media and other people out there, including me, the rankings don't make too much sense a lot of the times, this being a perfect example. I think since Darren Till and Stephen Thompson both suffered pretty rough knockout losses, they were both, I believe, the first knockouts of either guy's career, I think they should both, without a doubt, take a bunch of time off, maybe not fight till fall or so. And when they do come back, I wouldn't hate either seeing those two fight each other. They've already fought once. It was another one of those extremely controversial decisions. The fight, I believe, was in Liverpool, which is where Darren Till's from. Personally, I thought Stephen Thompson won the fight, although it was close. I think the majority of the MMA media agreed with me, and I don't think it'd be a bad idea to run that one back. I think there was a little bit of home cooking as far as the judging went. It wasn't quite the fireworks that everyone expected from that fight, but considering how both fighters' last fight ended, I think both those, like I said, I think both those guys should take a ton of time off, and once they're ready to come back, either fight each other or fight someone that's ranked much lower in the rankings, maybe like at the bottom of the top 15, so each guy has a chance to get their confidence back. Because now Darren Till suffered 2 pretty rough losses in a row. Darren Till's first one was to the long-reigning champ Tyron Woodley. So a lot of people, I think, just wrote that off as he got caught by Tyron Woodley. Maybe he's a little bit too anxious. You know, he was super young going into that fight. He had a ton of hype behind him, and he just got caught like many people have by Woodley. Woodley hits hard, but even, you know, after that shot that Woodley landed on him, it did knock Till out. And after that, Woodley was hitting him with some pretty brutal ground and pound, some crazy elbows, some strong shots that never put Till out. So getting knocked out by Jorge Masvidal, although Jorge Masvidal definitely has good stand-up, I don't think anyone will argue against that. He's never been known as a power puncher or one-punch KO guy. So eventually when Darren Till does come back, if he wants to stay in the welterweight division, which I think is a big if, I think a bunch of people would like to see him go up to the middleweight division, especially after a crazy knockout like that. It's been well known for a while that Darren Till, he's a pretty huge welterweight. It's been well known for a while that he's had a really hard time making that cut to 170. So I'd love to see him go up to 185. I think there's plenty of good fights for him up there. But if ultimately he comes back and he decides that he wants to stay at 170. I think the rematch with Stephen Thompson is a good one, or like I mentioned before, I think he should fight someone much lower down the rankings, maybe like a Neo Magny or something, to give him the chance to get his confidence back. Same thing goes for Stephen Thompson. He looked great in the Showtime fight, but before that fight, I believe he had been knocked down in each of his last 3 previous performances. So I think fighting someone maybe ranked at like the bottom of the 15 would definitely do his career good, give him a chance to get his confidence back, give him a chance to get a little bit of his mojo back. And Wonderboy is now 36 years old. He's not getting any younger, unfortunately. And in his last 5 fights, he only has 1 victory, although his last 5 fights have all been against stiff competition. And like I mentioned earlier, I definitely think his fight against Darren Till should have went in his favor. But, you know, sometimes when you leave it up to the judges, that's what happens, especially when you're fighting a guy that is fighting in his hometown. So anyways, moving on to the last fight I want to talk about. And this one involves Tyron Woodley. I know Tyron Woodley wanted the immediate rematch against Kamaru Usman, and I can't really say I blame him, or I can't really say he doesn't deserve it. He was a long reigning champion. He beat a ton of guys. He's held on to that belt for a long time. And although not all those performances have been very exciting, he did win. So you can't really hold against the guy when he wants an immediate rematch, especially considering the other immediate rematches that the UFC has given out over the last couple of years that I believe were far much less deserved. So if you take all that into account, I think I can completely understand where Tyron Woodley is coming from, although that's not the fight I want to see right away. And the reason being is if you watched the Woodley fight versus Kamaru Usman, it just happened. It was not, as much as I like Tyron Woodley, I think he's an extremely talented fighter. The fight was not close by any means. He got completely dominated in every aspect of that fight. And he didn't really give us any reason to believe that the second fight, especially if it happens anytime soon, would go any different. But if you ask me my opinion, what I think is best for his career as far as his next fight goes is fighting someone like a Santiago Ponzinibbio. Once again, going back to the UFC rankings, Santiago Ponzinibbio is ranked number 9, which to me is crazy. That dude's won 7 fights in a row in the UFC's welterweight division. How he is not closer to a title shot at this point or ranked higher than number 9 blows my mind. It just does not make any sense. You have Jorge Masvidal, who's a great fighter. Can't take that away from him. But like I said, he's 1 and 2 in his last 3 fights, all at welterweight. And he's ranked number 4. Santiago Ponzinibbio is ranked 5 spots lower than him, and he's won 7 in a row. Once again, the rankings are a little bit crazy sometimes, but I love that fight. Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Tyron Woodley. It gives Tyron Woodley a chance to get his mojo back. It gives him a chance to get his confidence back, and it gives Santiago Ponzinibbio that much deserved fight against somebody in the top 5, especially somebody that was a long reigning champ such as Tyron Woodley. I believe Santiago Ponzinibbio should be much, much closer to a title shot. And if you're not going to give him that title shot anytime soon, at least give him someone like a Tyron Woodley so he can prove himself and prove to the UFC that he does deserve that title shot. I think that's a great fight for both fighters. Give Tyron Woodley a little bit of a step down in competition. Like I said, give him a chance to get his confidence back. Maybe a little bit of confidence back in his striking, because throughout the Kamaru Usman fight, for whatever reason, he looked really hesitant to engage or really hesitant to let his hands go. His corner kept mentioning that throughout the fight, and for whatever reason, Tyron Woodley just kind of seemed locked up that whole fight. He was, for whatever reason, he seemed very unwilling to engage, very unwilling to throw his hands, and he just seemed kind of out of it the whole fight. So I'd love to see him get a chance to redeem himself and give him a little bit of a chance to earn that rematch. So if I was UFC Matchmaker Sean Shelby, those are the fights that I would book at the top of the UFC welterweight division. That is a wrap for this video. That's all I got to say about this for now. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with me or disagree. Maybe there's someone I missed. Maybe there's a fight I missed. Maybe you completely agree with the fight bookings. Maybe you don't. Either way, let me know below. Let me know what your guys' opinion is. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll catch you in the next video.
My goodness! Oh my God! Just like that! That is some serious power! Wow!